Hi everyone, it's Mr. Sinti, and today I'd like to discuss with you a little bit of the anatomy of the heart. I'd like to talk to you in particular about the valves of the heart. There's going to be four valves that are really important in the heart. And before we get into that discussion, I want to sort of kick around general anatomy of the heart just so that we can be most familiar. And so you might know this, but you may not, that the heart is composed of four chambers. That's right. We have two of these smaller chambers and thin walled chambers at the top of the heart called atria. And this is the right side of the heart here. And so what we have here is that deoxygenated blood fills up the right atria, and it gets into the right atria or atrium from the superior vena cava coming from the upper part of the body and the inferior vena cava, which is blood traveling up from the lower extremities, like in other words the midsection of the body and the lower legs, and both of those fill up the right atrium. And then the blood travels past this first valve. There's going to be four valves. This valve over here on the right side of the heart is referred to as the tricuspid valve because it's made up of three cusps. And it's also known as the atrioventricular valve. It separates blood from the atria and the right ventricle, and it prevents backflow into the atrium when the ventricle contracts, and it pushes blood through the pulmonary semilunar valve, which is the second valve right there. Pulmonary semilunar valve, when deoxygenated blood is traveling off towards the lungs, right here. And then when blood comes back from the lungs, of course it is oxygenated. And it's coming toward the heart via a vein. And it's coming towards the heart and it fills up the left atrium. And the left atrium then contracts and pushes the blood through the third valve, which is the mitral valve. It's also known as the tricuspid valve. It's also an atrioventricular valve because it separates the atrium and the ventricle. So the blood comes into the left ventricle, and look how muscular that left ventricle is. And then when that contracts, it forces the blood out, and this fourth valve opens up, and this is the aortic semilunar valve. Of course, because it's entering into the aorta, which is the largest artery, and it's going to the rest of the body via the systemic circuit. Okay? And just a little anatomy here is there's a septum that divides both the right and the left ventricles. So hopefully that was helpful. Another diagram of the heart looking at this blood flow. So again, it's coming in from the superior vena cava, or sometimes known as the anterior, and it's also coming up into the right atrium through the inferior vena cava, also known as the posterior vena cava, because it's a little bit more towards the back than the front. Just to point out a little bit on that, we talk about the right side of the heart and the left side of the heart. The truth is, as the heart's sitting there in the chest, right below the sternum, the breastbone, it's a little bit more like what you're looking at is like a top of the heart and back of the heart. And the right ventricle really is the anterior side, and the left ventricle is a little bit towards the posterior. Truth be known. And then the right ventricle, again, is pumping through the pulmonary semilunar valves, and then it's entering back into the left atrium. It's going through the mitral valve, and then it comes back out through the aortic semilunar valve. So there's four valves. The importance of the valves are that they're controlling and preventing backflow of blood. And again, I mentioned this before, that there's two circuits. One circuit is when the right ventricle contracts, it's sending blood to the lungs, both the right lung and the left lung. It's getting oxygen, it's getting rid of carbon dioxide, and then it's traveling back towards the left atrium. And that's the pulmonary circuit. And then when the left ventricle contracts, it goes raging with high pressure out of the aorta and travels through the whole body, and it delivers oxygen and other nutrients to the body. And then when it returns to the body, it's returning to the right atrium. Okay, so as I mentioned before, the the right ventricle is pumping to the lungs. And you notice how the myocardium, which is that muscular layer of the heart, do you notice how it's a lot thinner, the right ventricle, than it is on the left side? Look at the left side. It's really, really muscular. And so it's sort of conducive to its main function, which is really pumping to the entire body. And I find that this section is pretty interesting to consider. Now, I mentioned that the atria receive blood and that the ventricles are pumping blood out. And so, in order to totally get that concept, since it's happening simultaneously, I wanted to show you a little animation that we have here. And again, just to orientate, again, here's the atria on the top and here's the ventricle over here. Now, if I were to push this, take a look here. Do you notice how both the atrium are filling up simultaneously? And then the ventricles are also pumping simultaneously. Okay, so when the AV valves are open, the blood travels to the ventricle, obviously. And when this AV valve, which is the mitral, opens, the blood goes into the ventricles. But notice when the ventricles contract. When the ventricles contract, the AV valves close. And that's to prevent the backflow. Because when the ventricles contract, the blood's supposed to be going up the semilunar valves, either to the whole body or to the lungs. And I find that that's a useful consideration. It's a little difficult to draw that. It's above my ability to draw. Okay, and so let's come back over here if we can. Perhaps we can't. Perhaps we can. Let's see here. Maybe. Let's see. Sorry about that. All right, let's see if we can get that. And come over here. And whoops. Okay. All right. We'll roll with this. Okay. So that was the animation that I wanted to show you. Okay. And let's see here. Okay. All right. So here's an interesting picture with the atria removed. So you're looking down onto the heart. And you're looking in particular at the ventricles. And so here are the semilunar valves. One's going to the lungs right here, and the other one's going to the aorta, which is right here. Now this bicuspid side, of course, is on the left side. This is sometimes known as the mitral valve, but it's called bicuspid because it's made up of two cusps. And the tricuspid is made up of three leaflets right here, and this is, of course, the AV valve connecting the right atrium with the right ventricle. Okay, so here's an actual picture. See if you can tell what that is. Well, notice it has two cusps right here, and so therefore it's the bicuspid valve right there, the bicuspid. And let me come back here, bicuspid valve right there. And so this atrioventricular valve ensures, as I mentioned before, that there's no backflow between in this case, the bicuspid, there's no backflow between the left ventricle and the left atrium to make sure it's all getting out into the aorta. Take a look at this. This is a really interesting shot here. This is the three cusps of the tricuspid valve. And so again, this is separating the right atrium from the right ventricle. Again, another diagram of this. You can see here is the mitral valve over here, and then over here is the tricuspid valve here. Now, I want to make a really important point. I'm going to talk a little bit about these heart strings, which are on the inside of the heart. These tendon-like structures that are attached to the AV valves. So these structures are known as chordae tendinii. Chordae tendinii. So they're tendon-like structures that are attached to the AV valves, in other words, the bicuspid and tricuspid. And what they do is they're attached down here to papillary muscles on the inside of the ventricle. And when these papillary muscles pull down on the chordae tendinii, they're able to make sure that the valves are not inverting and when the ventricles are contracting. And so they're really important. They prevent backflow ultimately back into the atria. And so here's another diagram of this. We have these papillary muscles right here and right here, and there's various tendon-like heartstrings that are attached to the mitral valve. And so when these papillary muscles contract, they pull on these heartstrings, and they help to manipulate the valve to make sure that it is properly working. When you look at the chordae tendineae and the papillary muscles together, sometimes that's referred to as the subvalvular apparatus, if you're into that kind of terminology. Now, when the papillary muscles are relaxed, this is when the valve is open. So the bicuspid valve, which is over here, are obviously on the left side. This is the mitral valve. So when these guys are relaxed, the atria are contracting, and the blood is flowing right there into the left atrium. And then when the ventricle contracts right here and it's shooting out the aortic semilunar valve, then these are contracting and therefore pulling the cuspid closed, preventing backflow. So those are really important heartstrings. And so when we talk about valves, obviously they close, and they close in unison. And so when we listen to the heart with this instrument called a stethoscope, we hear a classic familiar sound of the heartbeat. Sometimes we refer to it as, bum, 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 bum. But actually it's more like a lub-dub, lub-dub, lub-dub sound as it's described. And so what the first sound that you hear, that lub, is when the AV valves are closing. And so the tricuspid and bicuspid are closing, and then the shutting of that is the lub. And it prevents, as I've said a couple of times, the backflow of blood when the ventricles are contracting, which is known as cardiac systole or systole. When the ventricles are contracting, it's forcing the blood out of the semilunar valves and therefore causing the AV valves to shut, and the shutting gives the sound of lub. So the AV valves closing is the lub sound. And so the dub, of course, is when the ventricles are relaxing, or diastolic or distally. When the ventricles are relaxing, the atria are contracting, and so that means the blood's flowing past the AV valves into the ventricles, and so the semilunar valves, both pulmonary and aortic, close, dub. So it's lub-dub, lub-dub, lub-dub. So it's pretty cool. So when you're listening, thought I'd include myself in this right here. So when you're listening to the sounds of the heart, the lub-dub with the stethoscope, you're actually not putting it directly on where you would believe the valves to be. You listen a little bit higher if you're listening to the aortic valve, and a little bit over here on this side is the pulmonary valve. This is the right side, this is the left side. And again, the tricuspid, you'd listen down here, and the mitral valve, you listen a little bit lower. Okay? And so you may have, what's the point of listening to this? Well, there's a variety of reasons physicians want to listen to the heart, but one of them is that sometimes the heart it will make murmur type sounds, and it's sort of a swishing or a whoosh sound made by the turbulent blood that's flowing past a valve that potentially is not closing properly. And so in this case, you can see here the pulmonary semilunar valve is not closing. If you recall that it's not a clear lub-dub, you'd hear as a sort of a murmur sound, because there's a little regurgitation, in this case, of blood flowing back into the ventricle. Likewise, there could be other murmurs, like, for example, over here, the tricuspid valve, which is the AV valve over here on the right side, can have some regurgitation as well. Now, these murmurs could be present at birth, and you call things that are when you're born with them congenital, and or they could develop later in life. It isn't a disease per se, but it could indicate that there could be a heart problem. I'm not a physician, but the most stressed valves, you're looking at this mitral valve, and that's under a lot of pressure because when the ventricles contract again, it's with a lot of force, and so sometimes these mitral valves develop some issue. And so I mentioned this term systole and diastole, or systole and diastole. It's basically when you're talking about the cardiac cycle. When the ventricles are relaxed, it's referred to as ventricular diastole or diastole, and when they contract, it's ventricular systole or systolic. Okay, and that's the complete cardiac cycle. When the heart contracts, blood is being pumped, and the atria contract, it's going into the ventricles, and then when the ventricles contract, which are the largest chambers, it's pumping blood to the lungs, and it's pumping blood to the rest of the heart. So the left ventricle pumps blood in the systemic circuit, and the right ventricle pumps blood towards the lungs in the pulmonary circuit. Okay, now the heart, it's pretty hard working, as one might imagine, and so it's kind of like the analogy would be like when you're flying in an airplane, and God forbid that there's something happens and oxygen has to come down from overhead. You know how they always say that make sure that you assist and you put a mask on your children before you put it on. Or actually, I actually misspoke there. You put it on yourself before you put it on your kids. And I always wait a minute, you would think you'd want to save the kids, but if you don't have oxygen, then you're not going to be able to save anybody else. And so that's kind of important. So, when you get into a discussion, what's the first organ that the heart pumps blood to? And you're like, I don't know, maybe it's the brain or something like that. In fact, the first organ that the heart pumps blood to is the heart itself. Because when the blood's being pumped out of the left ventricle, and it's going up here in the largest artery, which is called the ascending aorta, there's two little arteries that branch off the aorta. Do you see here? This one's known as the right coronary artery, and then over here is the left coronary artery. Really crucial, because this highly oxygenated blood needs to travel down, of course, and then arterioles and then capillaries. It needs to provide blood to the heart itself, especially the myocardium. So the right coronary artery and left coronary artery are really crucial in feeding the heart muscle itself. Now, the heart, it's a hungry heart. And so the heart pumps blood through the rest of the body, but it's one of its most important customers. And you can see here, check out this photograph here of all the different coronary arteries that surround the heart. Now, those are really important. This video isn't going to discuss it, but I'm going to produce another video on cardiovascular disease. And I think, one of the leading causes of death, unfortunately, is a heart attack, and that's caused by a blockage of the coronary arteries or coronary vein. And so the heart's powerful muscle, and it contracts day and night from even before we're born till the day we die. And these coronary arteries are really crucial in delivering oxygen and nutrients to every single heart cell. And so I hope you enjoyed this video it covered a lot of different things, but in particular the valves of the heart. Thanks for watching.